Welcome to the Colorado Outdoors Magazine. Live life outside. July-August 2024 issue. Read by John Arnold. Budding bighorns. Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep navigate some of the most rugged terrain in the Rockies. Article by Lisa Ballard. I remember the first time I saw a bighorn sheep. I was in my mid-20s heading west on I-70 from Denver to go skiing. From the passenger seat, I mindlessly watched the foothills grow into mountains. I had done the drive countless times before. Somewhere around the exit for Silver Plume, something brown caught my eye on a steep, rocky hillside. A bighorn sheep grazed placidly near the top of a sunny slope, far above the highway. "Bighorns!" I shouted excitedly to my friends in the car, but they were either sleeping or on the wrong side of the vehicle for a clear view. As I scanned the slope, I spotted several more bighorn sheep with their iconic curling horns. When we rounded a curve, they disappeared from sight. 40 years later, whenever I drive that stretch of highway, I still look longingly for the bighorns. I've seen them there only 2 other times, but on many other occasions in other places in Colorado, I've watched these agile, intriguing animals, likely because there's a lot more bighorn sheep around than 40 years ago. Conservation comeback. Coyote, fox, various wildcats, especially mountain lions, and golden eagles are natural predators of bighorn sheep, especially young lambs. Bighorns also die from falling off cliffs. They may be built for their precipitous mountain and canyon habitats, with their low center of gravity and spongy hoofs that help them grip the rock, but sometimes they slip. However, natural predation and accidental tumbles are not the reason why bighorn sheep almost disappeared from the landscape by the early 1900s. Wild sheep have died from these kinds of natural causes since their prehistoric ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to North America during the Pleistocene epoch, 750,000 years ago. Their troubles began when European settlers showed up. When the earliest mountain men blazed trails into the Rocky Mountains, bighorn sheep numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Coveted for their meat and massive curling horns, their numbers declined due to market hunting, as well as encroachment on their winter range by ranchers and farmers, who also exposed them to domestic sheep. Domestic sheep carry diseases such as scabies and pneumonia, lethal to bighorns. By the turn of the 20th century, only a couple hundred bighorn sheep remained in Colorado. Beginning in the 1940s, Colorado Parks and Wildlife began trapping and transplanting bighorn sheep to help rebuild its herds. The area near Silver Plume was one of those original spots. Known as the Georgetown Herd, there are now 300 bighorns in that area, one of the biggest populations in the state. Since those early relocations, CPW has since moved 100 bighorns into other parts of their historic range. There are now 7,000 wild sheep statewide, a large enough population to afford limited hunting opportunities. Those are precious tags indeed, and not for the weak of heart and leg. Chasing a bighorn takes the confidence to navigate in some of the most rugged terrain in the Rockies, with the potential for wild, wintry weather. Bighorn sheep are a conservation success story, though CPW's wildlife biologists keep a close eye on them. The diseases that domesticated sheep carry remain a threat that could cause bighorn populations to quickly crash, an unwanted travesty that CPW works hard to avoid. After all, bighorns are one of Colorado's treasured native species, both the symbol of the department and the official state animal. About those horns. Bighorn sheep are named for their sizable, curling horns, which are true horns, not antlers. Wild sheep do not shed their horns, which can weigh up to 30 pounds per pair, or 10% of the body weight of a 300-pound ram. As a male sheep ages, its horns continue to grow like rings on a tree. The base of a trophy ram's horn can measure up to 17 inches in diameter. If you were to straighten them out, they would measure over 3 feet long. A large, older ram's horns are so massive that they look as if the horns inhibit their vision. They might. For this reason, some biologists theorize that rams purposely broom their tips of their horns to see better, or they might wear off while grazing or chip off while headbutting other bighorns. When it comes to attracting a mate, male bighorns literally ram each other with their heads to assert domination over one another and win over their females just prior to the rut. That said, headbutting is not limited to the rut. Rams also practice bar at other times of the year. It's a sound that sticks with you. Imagine two 300-pound animals charging each other at 20 to 40 miles per hour. The crash can be heard a mile away. Yet, two rams will commonly back off and then charge each other several times in a row until one of them finally walks away. Then they might do it again a few minutes later. Their thick skulls, which protect them like dense shields, are just one of the ways these animals withstand such blunt force to the head. Their horns are hollow, and their sinuses are enlarged to help absorb the impact. In addition, when a ram takes a deep breath prior to butting, the added oxygen enlarges the volume of blood under their skull to help absorb the blow and cushion their brain. Ewes, females, also have horns, but they are shorter, straighter, and smaller in diameter. Whereas a ram's horns continue to grow throughout their lifetime, a ewe's horns stop growing at about 10 inches long. The base of a ewe's horns, which is around 6 inches in diameter, are less than half the base of the ram's horns. More background on bighorn. Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, like the ones I saw from I-70, are one of 3 species of wild sheep native to North America and the prominent bighorn species in Colorado. The other 2 are Dall sheep in Alaska and Canada, and desert bighorn in the desert Southwest, including about 500 of them in arid areas in Colorado, such as Colorado National Monument, the Black Ridge Canyon Wilderness, along the Dolores River between Bedrock and Slick Rock, and the area around Delta. Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep inhabit the mountains and canyons of the Rocky Mountain and the Pacific Northwest at elevations above 6,000 feet during the summer and lower cliffy areas or south-facing slopes during the winter. They can tolerate deep snow. Bighorn sheep range in color from light brown to chocolate brown, with white on their rump, muzzle, and back of their legs. Rams can live up to 12 years in the wild. The average ram stands 35 to 40 inches at the shoulder and can measure over 70 inches from nose to butt. Mature ewes can live up to 14 years in the wild, are about 15% shorter in length, but weigh 30 to 50% less than their male counterparts because they are physically smaller and don't have such massive horns. Ewes, with their lambs, and rams hang out in herds, but not together except during the rut. Bighorn sheep are ruminants, similar to cattle, goats, and bison. They have 4 stages to their stomach. They graze voraciously on grass, shrubs in the winter. Then sit for a while on the edge of a precipice or partway up a rock wall, safe from predation, re-chewing and digesting what they ate earlier, i.e., chewing their cud. Bighorn ewes also retreat to the cliffs to give birth, which help protect their young from all but golden eagles. The bighorn rut occurs in late November through early December. Ewes typically give birth to 1 lamb per year, though sometimes 2. The lambs are born in May or June and can navigate the rocks with their mother within a couple of hours. After a week or so, the ewes and lambs gather into ewe herds, where the lambs continue to nurse for about 4 months. Since my first encounter with bighorn sheep near Silver Plume, I've seen bighorns in Rocky Mountain National Park, Royal Gorge on Pikes Peak, and atop Mount Blue Sky. Each time, it's an unexpected but welcome surprise. Their agility is something to marvel at, and when I see or hear them headbutting, it's a special moment that makes me pause and smile at my good fortune. How desert bighorns differ. Here are some key ways that Colorado's other bighorn sheep, the desert bighorn, is different from the more common Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. They tolerate hot, dry climates. They're smaller, topping out at about 250 pounds. They have longer legs but smaller bodies. Their fur is generally lighter in color. They can live for long periods without water but lose body weight in the process. Most of their water needs come from forage, though they will drink from water sources when available. Their rut is earlier, in August through early fall. And finally, A ram's horns are shaped differently, tending to curl down, then sweeping outward more. Lisa Ballard is an award-winning freelance writer and photographer who covers all kinds of outdoor recreation, wildlife, and conservation topics. She is a longtime contributor to Colorado Outdoors. Find out more at Lisa, Ballard, outdoors.com. Advice from the Sages for the Ages. Article by Ron Bullock. If you ignore the aromatic plant of the prairies, most dictionaries define a sage as a profoundly wise person. I always thought of a sage as someone akin to the old man of the mountain. Again, you must ignore the plant, the large yellow alpine flower of the same name, and instead envision an aged, cloaked and bearded man atop a mountain that you must arduously climb to get his intelligent advice. However, note that the definition of sage mentions neither old nor man, so I adjusted my thinking. To that end, I contacted 3 noted fly fishers who are both guides and book authors: Pat Dorsey, Michelle White, and Steve Schweitzer. The following is advice from these sages that will last for the ages. First, a little bit about each sage. Pat Dorsey has guided for 31 years and is co-owner of Bluegill Angler, a fly shop in Evergreen. He is synonymous with Cheeseman Canyon and is the author of 6 books: A Fly Fisher's Guide to the South Platte River, 2005, Fly Fishing Guide to the South Platte River, 2018, Colorado Guide Flies, 2015, Fly Fishing Tailwaters, 2016, Tying and Fishing Tailwater Flies, 2019, and Favorite Flies of Colorado, 2022. I contacted him for advice on tailwaters and freestone rivers. Michelle White is an outfitter, guide, and owner of Tumbling Trout, a fly shop in Lake George. She prides herself on being an instructor and is the author of 3 fly fishing books: Lesser-Known Fly Fishing Venues in South Park, Colorado, 2016, Even Joe Schmo Can Catch a Fish, 2020, and The Subaru-able Brookie Venues in South Park, Colorado, 2022. Michelle offered advice on fishing small mountain streams. Steve Schweitzer has fly fished for over 40 years. He is best known for his book, A Fly Fishing Guide to Rocky Mountain National Park, 2010, and is also the author of A Fly Fishing Guide to the Indian Peaks Wilderness Area, 2014, and Designing Poppers, Sliders, and Divers, 2017. Steve guides in Rocky Mountain National Park for Kirk's Fly Shop. I contacted Steve for advice on high lakes, and he also opined on several streams. All 3 sages gave tips on how to plan and prepare for upcoming fishing trips. Each stressed the need to research the water you intend to fish and pay attention to the variables of the seasons. For example, when fishing rivers and tailwaters, Dorsey stressed knowing the dates and time of day when certain insects hatch. He also advised checking stream flows, which are readily available online. Before a trip, Dorsey suggested practicing knots so that time is not wasted on the water. Schweitzer stressed the need to research lakes to ensure that the one you intended to visit contains trout, and to know when that lake thaws so that you do not hike a long distance only to find a barren or frozen lake. He also said that anglers should match their hiking ability with the distance and elevation gain needed to reach a backcountry lake or stream. White and Schweitzer also mentioned the need to navigate in the backcountry. Before going on a trip, both mentioned that anglers should download cell phone apps such as OnX or GAIA GPS, which integrate maps with GPS coordinates. Schweitzer said that he also carries National Geographic topographical maps and a compass as backup. It is also wise, as Schweitzer pointed out, to check weather forecast for the duration of a multi-day trip and to leave a detailed itinerary with family or trusted friends. Tips on equipment varied somewhat among the sages, mostly due to the different waters they commonly fish. Dorsey covers equipment extensively in his book on tailwaters and his 2 books on the South Platte. He approves of most anglers' choice of a 9-foot, 5-weight fly rod, a reel with a smooth drag, and a weight-forward floating line. Schweitzer also fishes a similar setup and stressed that a 5-weight is good for bucking wind on high lakes. On the other hand, White prefers a softer, shorter rod, no longer than 7 feet, so that you can navigate around the dense bank vegetation in narrow mountain streams. Schweitzer also uses a shorter rod in mountain streams. White said that you can use a smaller diameter reel with less backing on these streams because the small trout you encounter are not going to run very far. Although Dorsey and Schweitzer advocate leaders tapering to 5X and 6X that are about as long as their rod, White prefers 5-foot leaders tapering to 3X or 4X most of the time. She explained that quarters are confined on small streams, and you must often pull your leader out of the bushes, so a stronger tippet saves flies from breaking off. Both White and Schweitzer use Tenkara rods on more open streams. They both leave vests at home and keep accessories to a minimum, consisting of nippers, tippet, floatant, and a small assortment of tried-and-true patterns in a few sizes. Recommendations on these fly patterns varied among the sages due to the different waters they fish. However, each sage did stress matching fly patterns to insects one would encounter during the various seasons. For mayfly patterns, Dorsey suggested the RS2, pheasant tail, juju betas, stall cups betas, and chocolate form wing emerger, while for caddis he recommended the gold-ribbed hare's ear, bread crust, buckskin, and John Barr's caddis. Dorsey likes the Mercury midge and the Top Secret for midges, and also recommends Scuds and Pat's rubber legs. Schweitzer noted that high country trout are less picky and recommended ant, hopper, and beetle patterns, parachute Adams, elk hair caddis, and Griffith's gnats for dry flies, and pheasant tails, cold-ribbed hare's ears, red and pink San Juan worms, and midge pupil patterns for nymphs on a dropper. He also recommended pale morning duns and yellow sallies to match hatches in Rocky Mountain National Park and the Indian Peaks Wilderness. White only fishes a single dry fly in small mountain streams. She prefers larger, bushy dries up to size 12, such as an ant and hopper patterns, royal wolves, purple hazes, and Griffith's gnats. Approaching the water is a topic on which all three sages had similar strong opinions. Dorsey said that prior to wading out into a river, anglers should look for cooperative fish holding against the bank or in skinny water. White agreed with Dorsey's recommendation and added that an angler should move about stealthily, keeping a low profile and concealing themselves behind bushes and streamside vegetation. She recommended keeping your rod low so that it does not silhouette against the sky. Schweitzer said that anglers should refrain from wading in high mountain lakes to avoid damaging the aquatic vegetation where insects live, the food for high lake trout. White also said there is no need to wade in small mountain streams, other than to occasionally cross to the other side. As such, she leaves the waders at home and instead wears wading sandals with felt soles and nylon pants, which dry quickly. However, wading is often necessary to reach productive runs and structure in large freestones and tailwaters. A wading staff can help. Rather than stressing casting ability, the three sages cited the need for proper presentation, particularly a drag-free drift on freestones, trailwaters, and small mountain streams. Dorsey stressed the need for mastering the art of mending and keeping some slack in your drift so as not to unnaturally pull a fly along. White noted that in small streams, casts are generally short, but anglers should be proficient in roll casting due to overhanging vegetation. She added that anglers should keep their fly line off the water, and as such, she prefers to move downstream when fishing because it's easier to do this. Schweitzer noted that high country trout are opportunistic, and sloppy presentations don't always put a fish down, so the backcountry is a great place for beginners. Dorsey and Schweitzer stressed the importance of the first cast into a run or pool. Dorsey's concern is that a poor cast or drift can spook or put off fish, while Schweitzer's concern is that an angler should be prepared for an opportunistic take as soon as the fly hits the water. I asked the sages how long an angler should work an attractive pool or run before moving on. White chuckled and said, until one catches all the fish there. Of course, in the absence of hits or visibly feeding fish, all three sages suggested moving on quickly. Dorsey suggested within about 20 minutes. He explained that when guiding, he'll move about a lot, often covering a mile of river in a day, all the time looking for fish and knowing that the first few casts are often the most productive. However, both White and Dorsey said that if fish are feeding, you can stay for as long as it takes to figure out what they will take, if you're so inclined. White mentioned that if you disturb a pool, you can always return in 20 or 30 minutes to try again. Schweitzer noted that high country trout are either feeding or resting, so if a fish is uninterested in feeding, it's difficult to entice them. If a few well-placed drifts through a run produce no results, he said that an angler should move on. All three sages had the same opinion about changing flies. That is, if a pattern is working, don't change it. Dorsey added that he does not frequently change flies as long as he's confident that he's matching the hatch. When nymphing, he said he'll adjust his weight 10 times more frequently than changing his flies, explaining that presentation at the proper depth and speed is often more important than the pattern. White and Schweitzer noted that high country trout are opportunistic, so a properly presented pattern at the right size generally produces a strike. Both added that a pattern will continue to work even when most of the hackle has been chewed off. All three sages stressed the proper handling of fish, including wetting your hands and quickly releasing the fish back into the water. While Dorsey and Schweitzer use nets, White does not use a net on the small streams she fishes. She said the fish are small and can be quickly reeled in. She added that she slips her hand under the fish and that the use of barbless hooks allows her to quickly release it. I asked all three guides why an angler should hire a guide, and all three cited a shortening of the learning curve for fishing a particular water. Dorsey and White explained that guides are on the water almost every day during the season and know the water, the entomology, and the patterns that work. Guides are passionate about what they do and are good coaches, according to Dorsey, and you can become a better angler by using them. Schweitzer added that guides are also good for teaching an angler a new technique, such as check nymphing. White and Schweitzer said that they hire guides whenever they travel to new destinations, and I know that Dorsey uses guides when he travels to distant destinations. Both Dorsey and White concluded by stating that it is often a subtle thing that makes the difference between catching a few or many fish, and a guide can point this out. It may be a slight adjustment in your cast or adding a little more weight when nymphing. And as Schweitzer points out, a good guide need not be old. Young guides are often good because they spend many days on the water. Remember, the definition of sage makes no mention of old, and you need not climb a mountaintop in search of the bearded one. Ron Bullock is a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors and is the author of the award-winning books Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry and The Fly Fishing Guide to 800 High Lakes in Colorado. Both books are available on his website, ronbelak.com. This article is copyrighted by the author. White Nose Syndrome. A Deadly Pandemic Strikes Colorado Bats. Article by Mary Taylor Young. White nose syndrome is considered one of the worst wildlife diseases in modern times, having killed millions of bats across North America. Written by the White Nose Syndrome Response Team. In February of 2007, wildlife biologists in upstate New York doing a routine cave survey of bat colonies discovered a horrifying scene. Inside Hales Cave near Albany, instead of the large colony of hibernating bats hanging from the ceiling they expected to find, they discovered the bodies of thousands of the tiny winged mammals carpeting the cave floor. So many dead bats littered the cave that the surveyors couldn't take a step without hearing the crunch of tiny bones beneath their feet. Quote, "Seeing that first cave really shook me up," said Alan Hicks, a wildlife specialist with New York's Department of Environmental Conservation. "I've been visiting Hales for 30 years. It's always full of thousands of bats, and all of a sudden it was virtually empty of anything alive." End quote. The bodies of the dead bats all had mysterious white spots on their wings, and their muzzles were muffled with a white fuzz. Even the few bats that still clung to life from the cave's walls and ceilings were similarly coated with the white fuzz. Bat experts were puzzled about what was going on, hoping the die-off was just a single isolated event. But the next winter, every known cave within 75 miles was found littered with bodies of dead bats, all covered with the ominous white fuzz. The gruesome discovery would only be the first of many, as a new wildlife disease moved across eastern states and into the Midwest, killing millions upon millions of bats, wiping out regional populations and devastating some species to the brink of extinction. Colorado bat lovers and Colorado Parks and Wildlife began a grim vigil, monitoring the state's bats for evidence of WNS. After a decade and a half, there was no sign of the disease. Would Colorado bats somehow escape the scourge? The culprit. The new disease was dubbed white nose syndrome for the cottony growth that spreads across the muzzles of the infected bats. The fuzz, it turned out, is a fungus with an ominous name, Pseudogymnascus destructans. The cool, damp conditions in caves and crevices where up to half of North America bat species hibernate in the winter offer a perfect storm for the cold-loving fungus. Like a version of fungus that destroys humanity in TV series The Last of Us, the spores of the fungus land on wings, skin, and fur of the torpid bats and begin to grow across the animal's tissues. With their immune systems shut down, the hibernating bats are easy prey. Drying and destruction of the wing membranes severely dehydrates the bats, which don't rouse until they are too sick to fight off the attack. With their fat reserves depleted and no food available in the winter, few bats survive. The disease kills between 70 to 90% of the bats in affected colonies. Some colonies in the eastern U.S. have been wiped out completely, with caves that once hosted hundreds of thousands of bats left eerily still and empty except for the thousands of tiny carcasses littering the cave floor. Considered to be the worst wildlife disease outbreak ever in North America, WNS has shown little evidence of slowing down, and its impact goes far beyond killing bats. Without the bug-gobbling organic pest control services of millions of bats, American agriculture and other economic sectors could be impacted to the tune of billions of dollars each year. The fungus is native to Europe and China, where bats have adapted and are largely unaffected by it. So how did WNS get to America? Bats don't migrate from Europe or Asia to the Americas, so the fungus was almost certainly introduced by people. It is likely that recreational cavers and other cave visitors carried the spores on their boots, clothes, or gear into American caves where the fungus found the perfect conditions to flourish. Hales Cave in New York, where the disease was first found, adjoins a cave open to commercial tourism that is visited by 200,000 people a year. Exposed to a new disease they have no immunity to, the North American bats are being wiped out. Jacqueline Beck, bat research coordinator with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, a self-described bat person, described the WNS juggernaut in a 2016 article in Atlanta Magazine. Quote, "Bats in North America were as equipped to fight it as a parade of ants against a can of Raid. The fungus creeps into the muzzles of the bats while they hibernate, giving the disease its name. It permeates their wings, sometimes eating holes into the membranes. It wakes them early from their torpor, sending some of them out of their caves into the cold winter, where there's no food and their fat reserves are quickly depleted. Weakened, their immunity systems compromised, the bats fall from the sky. Others simply tumble from their roosting perches." End quote. WNS in Colorado. White nose syndrome spread like a fungal wildfire across the eastern United States and into the Midwest, wiping out an estimated 7 million bats and pushing some species to the brink of extinction. But it remained largely unknown in Colorado and the West. Could the western U.S. remain free of the fungus? Simple answer, no. In 2022, researchers doing a surveillance study for the National Park Service detected the fungus on a Yuma bat, Myotis yumanensis, collected at Bent's Old Fort National Historic Site near La Junta, though that bat and 24 others showed no symptoms of WNS. But the next year, another Yuma bat at Bent's Fort was found to be infected with the disease, the first confirmed case in Colorado. Then, in February 2024, an obviously sick little brown bat was found crawling on a bike path in Longmont. Summoned to collect the bat, the wildlife rehabber found it to be severely dehydrated. Its wing membranes were so dry and brittle that it couldn't fly. Testing confirmed that the bat was ill with white nose syndrome. 2 weeks later, a second infected little brown bat was found in Boulder. WNS has also been found in 3 other sites, in Baca, Larimer, and Routt counties, including in 3 little brown bat summer roosts. Other possible locations in several other Colorado counties are currently awaiting confirmation. Why had it taken 15 years for WNS to affect bats in Colorado? Probably because bats in Colorado, a state that lacks the vast caves of many eastern states, seem to be using an entirely different habitat for hibernation, explains Dan Newbaum, Species Conservation Program Manager for CPW. In the eastern U.S., bats hibernate in large cave and cave systems, in the hundreds of thousands, making it easy to monitor and learn what's going on with the various bat populations. But researchers have not been sure where Colorado bats spend winter. For his master's degree, Newbaum studied big brown bats on the Front Range west of Fort Collins and learned they move from their summer roosts around buildings to rocky slopes and boulder fields in the mountains. Instead of caves, they crawl into crevices between the boulders, which can be large and act like mini caves. When he took on Colorado's WNS program for CPW, Newbaum recreated his big brown bat research but targeted the small bats in the genus Myotis, which includes the Yuma and little brown bats, the first species found to be infected with the WNS in Colorado. Quote, "I started with a little brown bat maternity colony in an old cabin along the Crystal River near Carbondale," end quote, he explains. Instead of migrating when winter closed in, the bats made a short distance move, up to higher elevation talus slopes and boulder fields, opposite of what might be expected. Quote, "In late October and early November, the talus got covered with 12 feet of snow, creating perfect hibernating conditions, cool and constant. They like it just above freezing, like 35 to 37 degrees Fahrenheit. It amazes me how they dial in these spots to stay constant," end quote. The boulder field of big rocks in a jumbled mass creates large crevices, he says, something like a little cave system. Sometimes little streams run through all winter under the insulating blanket of snow, and there may even be insects still active. Quote, "We learned that rock crevices in different locations can offer ideal hibernaculum conditions," end quote. Our assumption is that the bats are more dispersed, grouped in small numbers, unlike the big cave colonies, so that they may make a difference on how they're exposed to WNS, end quote, he explains, because there are fewer bats for the fungus to infest. WNS transmits from bat to bat. One infected bat can infect and wipe out a vast colony. Quote, "Time will tell," end quote. Though WNS has wiped out millions of bats and vast colonies, bringing some populations to the brink of local extinction, some individuals survive, even among the very vulnerable little brown bat, which has lost 90% or more of its population in some places. The fungus has been present in Europe and Asia for a very long time, and those bats have adapted to it. Quote, "We see a lot of their bats are used to the fungus and it doesn't wipe them out. Those bats can cope with the white nose. That may be the best hope for North American bats," says Newbaum. "Those survivors are the ones that may help the population recover," end quote. As WNS grows among Colorado bats, Newbaum is hopeful that some populations, quote, "will hang in there and support our species," end quote. Small species, like those in the general mitosis and pipistrelle, are particularly sensitive to fungus, explains Newbaum. Bats are often described as mice with wings, and myotis means mouse-eared. The little brown bat is indeed little and brown, weighing only about 1/3 of an ounce. That's about the weight of 2 pencils. CPW researchers have collected additional samples of sick and dead bats that may indicate WNS in other Myotis species. In the eastern states, all the bats in the genus Myotis have been affected to some degree. As the disease moves west, it's affecting multiple Myotis species in Montana and the Dakotas. Quote, we have good data that those smaller Myotis are more affected. Some of the species Myotis in Colorado that stick more to those remote rock fields may take longer to confirm because it's longer until we encounter a dead one." End quote. Newbaum suspects the bats found in Boulder County and the other areas in the winter probably roused and tried to reach their summer feeding grounds to avoid starvation, but they were too sick and ended up dead or dying in places where other people encountered them. Fortunately, not all species are as vulnerable as the little mouse ears. WNS does not seem to affect pollinating bats, like the yucca pollinating desert bats we can thank for tequila and mezcal, or bats that migrate instead of hibernating. In Colorado, says Newbaum, quote, "the big-bodied bats like Townsend's big-eared bats and the big brown bats seem to be handling WNS much better. We feel they're coping even when exposed, and they're not dying in big numbers. We're not going to lose all of our bats, but a cohort of them. That helps focus our efforts on those we know are vulnerable." End quote. What CPW is doing. For CPW biologists trying to battle this devastating disease, learning more about the life histories of Colorado bats, where they spend winter, how they might be vulnerable to WNS, is critical. Using new information, CPW is making use of computer models that better predict where bats might be in the state and refining species distribution maps. They're also tracking bats to understand where and when they are on the landscape, not an easy task with such tiny, nocturnal subjects. Quote, "They're small, cryptic, really hard to track. We can't fly over and count them or put collars on them to track them. But there's a new tool to monitor their populations that's super helpful. Acoustic locators," end quote. Sound detectors are set out in grid patterns, similar to surveying drone for birds. Quote, "It's like a Christmas bird count for bats," end quote. The locators pick up the echolocation pulses put out by the bats. Any bat that flies over is picked up by the detectors and recorded, and then biologists study the acoustic signature of their calls to pinpoint the species. Like the song of the birds, the echolocation calls of bats, which are used for navigation and hunting, are specific to a species. Quote, "For the first time ever, we're starting to get data on population trends, including places you don't usually think of bats being, like the alpine tundra and the eastern plains," end quote. The data gives baseline information on what populations were like before the arrival of WNS. Quote, "and where we need to get back to as we find solutions," end quote. Researchers are also visiting summer locations like maternity colonies in buildings where they can monitor the animals, do counts to see if the numbers have changed, and capture and swab the bats' wings and faces for evidence of WNS. Quote, "We go to locations in spring, like ponds where bats drink, and we mist-net them and swab them. We are netting them in the transition period as they emerge and move around. Females eventually show up at maternity roosts, which lots of our bat species do in groups, and those females raise their pups together," end quote. At these summer maternity sites, they also put down drop cloths to collect guano, which is then tested for WNS. Quote, "The mothers clean their fur and preen by licking, which ingests the fungus. That then comes out in the guano," end quote. Are there any treatments yet for WNS? Quote, "That's tough," says Newbaum. "We don't have a lot of good solutions. The most promising is a vaccination developed by a researcher with the U.S. Geological Survey. At those maternity colonies, we can capture 50 to 100 bats and vaccinate, then put a pit tag on vaccinated animals," end quote. A pit tag is similar to the identifying microchips put under the skin of pet dogs and cats, which can be read externally by a device. Quote, "We can read those pit tags so we know if the vaccinated animals are surviving at higher levels. If so, we can figure out how to distribute the vaccine on a broader scale. That's our best proactive tool at the moment," end quote. Newbaum thinks the bats themselves will be the most important dictators of the disease's progress. If some bats are resistant and survive, they will keep the species going. What you can do to help. Quote, "We're going to rely on the public and others to help monitor bats and help us learn about sick individuals," end quote. From the CPW Bat Sightings Forum. CPW has a list of steps on its website that the public can take to avoid spreading the disease, including staying out of closed mines and caves, decontaminating all gear, clothing, and footwear both before and after visiting or touring caves or other places bats live or roost, and never using any clothing or gear used in areas where WNS is found in places where it is not found. Cavers and the public can support the WNS fight by reporting any dead or sick bats they encounter, or even bats active in winter, by not touching the bat, but instead calling the Bat Line 303-291-7771 or emailing wildlife.batline@state.co.us. Quote, "The public can really help by reporting," says Newbaum, "especially in early to late spring, like February through May. That's when the bats that are sick from WNS show up. Late in summer, dead bats may have died from lots of other causes. Public reports have been really helpful in finding these new sick bats." End quote. Lastly, because bats often find their way into closed patio, canopies, outdoor umbrellas, and other outdoor items, never transport such things without first making sure a bat isn't roosting in its nooks, folds, or crannies. Visit CPW's website at cpw.state.co.us for more information on WNS. We should care about bats, both for them and for us. Bats provide quote-unquote ecological services, says Newbaum, by removing vast numbers of insects off the landscape each night, which adds up to millions of dollars of pest control value. But the worth of bats goes far beyond dollars and cents. Quote, "I was fascinated with bats," he says. "They're fascinating animals that are just one link in the chain. I want to do my part to take care of that link. We all carve out our niches for ourselves. For me, that's my legacy, to work with these animals and work for their conservation." End quote. Getting people to understand bats is the first step in changing societal attitudes about these flying mammals, and persuading them that bats are as important to the state's natural heritage as eagles or elk or mountain lions. Quote, "If people come out in the field with us and see one up close, they will see they are cool like these tiny fuzzy bears with wings, and that can immediately change their perception." End quote. Mary Taylor Young is a zoologist, nature writer, and author of 22 books about wildlife and the outdoors. She received the 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Colorado Authors League and is a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors. Bluebird Seasons, Witnessing Climate Change in My Piece of the Wild, was published in May 2023. Learn more at marytayloryoung.com. Boreal owls. The first nesting boreal owl in Rocky Mountain National Park. Article by Scott Rashid. In the spring of 1993, I assisted Dr. Ron Ryder, emeritus professor from Colorado State University, CSU, with the road consensus searching for boreal owls along Cameron Pass. After hearing several boreal owls and seeing one, I commented that the area we were surveying looked very similar to Hidden Valley in Rocky Mountain National Park. Ron said that the area should be a good location to search for the owls. A few evenings after assisting Dr. Ryder with his survey, I went to Hidden Valley in Rocky Mountain National Park and heard a vocalizing boreal owl, and, after a bit of hiking, was able to see it. Being a longtime national park researcher, studying small owls within the park, part of the research is to locate territories and active nests of boreal owls. Locating their nest is not an easy task, as the birds begin courting in January, and within their preferred habitat there is frequently several feet of snow on the ground, making it difficult to maneuver and locate the calling males and their nests. In 2007, I opened a banding station outside of Estes Park targeting northern saw-whet owls. Our station is part of a nationwide study called Project OwlNet. Researchers around the country capture and band these diminutive owls by the thousands, looking at migrating patterns, longevity, and more. Between 2007 and 2011, We captured and banded hundreds of northern saw-whet owls, but had never captured a single boreal owl. In 2011, RMNP management allowed me to open a research station within the park at Hidden Valley to study the movements of both boreal and northern saw-whet owls. To capture the owls, 3 40-foot mist nets were stretched between 2 10-foot metal poles. The nets were in a U shape, with 2 speakers placed in the center of the U. To capture boreal owls after dark, their territorial call was broadcast using an MP3 player. To capture northern saw-whet owls, their call was also broadcast. As the owls came to the call and flew around the speakers, they simply landed in one of the nets and are captured. During this process, the nets were checked every half hour. On October 3, 2011, at 9:40 p.m., a boreal owl was found in the bottom pocket of one of the nets. This bird was a juvenile female that had hatched the year it was captured. Its age and sex were determined by a combination of the wing length and the bird's weight. This juvenile bird was proof that boreal owls do, in fact, nest within the boundaries of Rocky Mountain National Park. Until 2019, no active boreal nets had ever been found within RMNP. On April 9, 2019, while searching for owls within RMNP, a male boreal owl was heard vocalizing and later seen. A little later, after 9 p.m., the male's snipe-like winnowing was heard a short distance within the woods. After moving toward the calling bird, it was seen perched on the branch of an Engelmann spruce. While watching the bird for a short time, it was seen flying in and out of a cavity in a dead spruce. The following morning, I made my way to where I presumed the area of the potential nest tree might be. Unfortunately, I was unable to locate the actual tree. That evening, I returned and found both male and female boreal owls calling and flying near the tree and landed on the branches of what would later be identified as their nest tree. The territorial call of the male boreal owls is a series of poo, 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 poo sounds. It sounds very similar to the sounds produced by the stiff tail feathers of a diving Wilson snipe. The call of the male owl becomes more rapid and often softer as the female approaches. The female often responds with a single high-pitched seep. On April 13th, I arrived at the nest site at 7:45 p.m., and I walked to the area of the nest tree. Before dark, a male was vocalizing from the nest cavity. It remained within the cavity for several minutes as the female could be heard giving a few plaintive single seep calls from somewhere within the forest. The following day, I contacted Scott Esser, director of the Continental Divide Research Learning Center at Rocky Mountain National Park, to request permission to place a trail cam near the nest tree, which would enable me to document these activities without bothering the nesting female. A few days later, after being granted the permit, I placed a trail cam on the adjacent tree. The camera was placed a few yards from the nest and pointed up toward the cavity. While I was attaching the camera to the tree, the female owl peered from the cavity and watched me for the few minutes it took me to finish. That same day, I called Greg Hayward, author of the Birds of North America number 63, Boreal Owl, to discuss the best way to monitor the species with the least amount of impact to them. He suggested that I stay away from the nest for a few weeks to allow the pair to decide that they like each other enough to pair up and raise a family. Once the camera was placed, I only needed to return every 4 or 5 days to change out the SD card and look at the footage. I was able to identify the difference between the male and the female and identify several prey items that the male delivered to the female in the nest. On April 23rd, while changing out the SD card, the male boreal owl began giving its familiar poo, 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 poo call. He was perched just a few trees south of the nest tree, yet I was unable to locate him. As the nesting season progressed, I discovered that the male owl perched far from the nest tree during the day and was never actually seen near the nest until he delivered prey to the female. His food deliveries were all after dark. No food deliveries were ever documented during the day. When speaking with Hayward, he told me that according to his radio-tagged birds, The male owl can be perching anywhere up to a kilometer from the nest tree at any point during the day. Looking at the video clips we captured, we noticed that the female would exit the nest each day for short periods, especially during incubation. There were 2 video clips of an adult bird perched outside of the nest during the day, but there was nothing seen that would suggest that the owls hunt during the day. The female would exit the nest every evening just after dark, and she would remain out of the nest for up to 15 minutes or less before re-entering. Not being able to see within the nest, it was estimated that the eggs hatched on about June 1st or 2nd, simply because June 2nd was the first day I climbed the tree to change the SD card, and the female did not look out at me. Each evening, the male would deliver prey to the nest. He would land on the branch near the nest, holding the prey with one foot. Just before he delivered the prey to the nest, he would place it in his mouth and fly to the cavity. He would hang on the edge, place his head inside the cavity, and presumably give the prey to the female, mouth to mouth. The interesting thing about the prey delivered by the male is that each item was completely intact, which suggested that the male hunted for himself and ate what he captured before hunting again for his family. He was seen delivering a northern pocket gopher, a montane vole, a deer mouse, a shrew, an American robin, and a white-crowned sparrow. There were a few items delivered, however, that could not be positively identified. June 21st was the first day and night that the female remained outside of the nest. She was away from the nest for 3 full days before returning to assist feeding the nestlings. When she did begin hunting for her family, she would partially consume each item before delivering it to the nestlings. The female was seen delivering an American robin, 2 Audubon's warblers, a shrew, and a vole, all partially eaten. On the evening of June 25th, the owlets could be heard begging from the nest cavity. Their call is a single, sharp chirp. The first owlet was seen peering from the nest on June 27th. After some observation, 2 different owlets could be identified. One had more white on its face than the other. The owlets took turns peering from the nest cavity, both day and night. The first owlet fledged on July 2nd at 9:01 p.m. It appeared to have fallen from the nest and landed a few feet below the cavity. The second owlet remained within the cavity. While the first owlet was perched below the cavity, the adult female flew in with an Audubon's warbler. She looked at both the fledgling and the nestling, seemingly trying to decide who to deliver the bird to. After a short bit, she flew to the cavity and dropped the bird inside. She flew and perched a few yards from the nest for a short time before flying out of sight. The following morning at 6:30 a.m., I arrived at the nest tree to find the second owlet peering from its cavity. I spent about 30 minutes looking for the first fledgling, which I did not locate. That evening, I returned to the nest tree where no owlets were seen or heard. After dark, no owlet ever looked from the cavity, which made me believe that the second owlet fledged during the day. At 9:30 p.m., I began searching the area for fledglings. Using an MP3 player, I began playing the food begging call of the fledglings. After a short while, both owlets could be heard begging. One was estimated 27 yards to the south, and the other was estimated 82 yards to the east. That was the last evening I heard the owlets. Less than a month later, the nest tree had blown over and was found on the ground, which enabled me to get measurements. The cavity the owls used was 21 feet, 8 inches from the ground. The cavity itself was 10 inches deep, and the entrance hole was about 2.5 inches in diameter. Scott Rashid is the director of CARRI and the author of 6 books, including Exploring the World of the Barn Owl, An Intimate Look into Their Secretive Lives, and American Kestrel, the Diminutive Raptor. This article is copyrighted by the author. Grassland Dandy. Article by Bruce Gill. He sat on a fence line that bisected a grazing pasture on the Pawnee National Grassland. Dressed in his gray coat, black vest, and chestnut collar, he looked like a real grassland dandy. He was newly arrived from his wintering area in the San Rafael grasslands of Arizona, where he had spent the winter with several others of his species. He was a chestnut-collared longspur. He belonged to a family of birds that were named for the long claw on their hind toes. Colorado is home to 3 species of longspurs: the Lapland longspur that winters here, and the thick-billed and chestnut-collared longspurs that breed here. As late as 1914, the chestnut-collared longspur was thought to be a rare summer visitor to the state. Then, in the spring of 1932, a group were found nesting in northern Colorado between Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Rockport, Colorado. Since then, they have been reported at various locations from every month of the year across the grasslands of eastern Colorado. In Weld and Washington counties, the summer and winter ranges of chestnut-collared longspur overlap. They regularly nest in the Pawnee National Grasslands of Weld County. Today, on the first day of May, a dapper male has established a breeding territory just above the bottom of the grassy swale, where the short grasses and mid-grasses intermix. His territory is slightly more than 1 acre in size, and abuts the territories of several other adult males that tend to clump together in suitable breeding habitat. Perched on a tall aster stalk, he begins to sing, his song melodious, similar enough to that of the western meadowlark, with whom he shares his breeding territory, that even experienced birders have mistaken the two. The song starts high and descends with melodious burbling warbles that last for about 2 to 3 seconds. Suddenly, he launches himself into the air and, with tail feathers spread wide, sings as he descends in a circular path until he lands back on the grass stem. The song and the flight, together with his distinctive black breast, are declarations to females that both the breeding territory and the male are available to a willing mate. But breeding territories are not uncontested. Males on adjacent territories counter the singing of their neighbors with songs of their own. And when singing alone fails to discourage encroaching neighbors or vagabonds from invading his territory, things can get downright physical. Early in the breeding season, it is not uncommon to see 2 males face each other in a threat display where they fly within 2 feet or less of each other and posture with their necks stretching upward at about a 45-degree angle, bills pointed away from each other. They may stay this way for several seconds, but if neither yields, they may then fly up into the air and engage each other with beating wings and claws. Typically, as they drop back to the ground, both peck and claw at the other until the loser concedes and flies away with the victor in hot pursuit. Adult males begin arriving in their breeding grounds in mid-April, and about 2 weeks later, when the adult females arrive, territorial boundary disputes have been mostly resolved. And now a different kind of skirmish begins. This time it's between females and over mates, not property. These fights, though similar to those of the males, are longer and more vicious, as females that have mates try to keep other females from stealing them. One such fight was timed from start to finish and lasted more than 15 minutes. Following the fertilization of her eggs, the female sets out to select a nest site. She alone selects the site. This year, it is on the edge of a shallow swale where short and taller grasses intermingle, and where the grasses are interspersed with patches of broom snakeweed. Here she finds both shade and concealment for her nest. Next, she excavates a shallow, hemispherical depression about 3.5 inches in diameter in the bare ground beneath the tuft of purple 3-on grass. Starting from the bottom and working upward, she weaves a nest from the dead leaves and stems of nearby grasses. The top of the nest she anchors to adjacent stalks of vegetation and finishes by lining the nest with hairs and grass leaves. The nest takes her 5 days to complete from start to finish. When the female nears her fertile period, the male follows her constantly. He will guard her closely until she begins to lay her eggs, after which she is no longer receptive to breeding. As she endures 16 days from laying the first egg until all eggs hatch, she will receive little aid from her mate. He may occasionally bring her food and very rarely spell her with incubation chores, but most incubation is a female chore. Later, after the young hatch, the male's work begins. He will make nearly 80% of all the feeding trips to feed the young, but only if it is the first brood of the season. Chestnut collar longspur pairs frequently attempt a second nest if they successfully fledge their first brood. Dr. Dorothy P. Hill, conservation biologist with Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, noticed something different in the behavior of males toward their second brood. The second time around, the male was less attentive to the nestlings, making less than half of the total feeding trips to the hatchlings. Intrigued, Dr. Hill searched for an explanation. Like many birds, chestnut-collared long-spurred females, given the opportunity, will breed with more than one male. Their mates attempt to minimize these so-called extra pair matings in two ways. First, they closely guard their females and aggressively drive off would-be suitors. This works only partially because females are still able to sneak off and have trysts with neighboring males. But when they return to their mate's territory, he tries to force her to mate with him, presumably to assure that his sperm fertilizes her eggs. Usually, she tries to fend off his advances, but in doing so, spends precious energy she needs for egg laying. In addition, the male can be quite physical in his advances and may cause injury to the female. Both consequences tend to minimize extra pair matings that lead to future broods. Second broods, on the other hand, are a different matter altogether. The female becomes fertile while her mate is still occupied with feeding the young of her first brood. Now, while her mate is preoccupied, she has ample opportunity to seek extra pair matings. Hill theorizes that males somehow are able to, quote, assess their paternity and adjust their paternal care, end quote, and reduce the number of trips to feed the young of the second brood. By reducing the number of feedings, the male minimizes his investment of time and energy in the offspring of other males and can devote that time and energy to feeding himself. As a result, he enters the winter in better condition and increases his chances of surviving to next spring, when he will have the opportunity to produce another first brood, the majority of which will be his own offspring. Regardless of which parent does the feeding, raising young to the flying or fledging stage is a grueling process. One study timed the number of trips parents made to bring food to the nestlings and found that at peak demand, they made 16 trips per hour. Over a 17-hour feeding period, that amounts to 272 feeding trips per day. Here in Colorado, chestnut-collared longspurs share their habitats with at least 3 other bird species with similar ecological requirements: horned larks, thick-billed longspurs, and lark buntings. Given ever-shrinking habitats of eroding quality, how these species avoid competing with each other is another fascinating part of the chestnut-collar longspur's life story. These 4 species have evolved behaviors that minimize competition by partitioning resources in both time and space. They use different breeding and nesting habitats at different times during the breeding season. Horned larks and thick-billed longspurs prefer habitats with much shorter vegetation and more open spaces than either lark buntings or chestnut-collared longspurs, both of which prefer habitats with more densely growing mid-sized grasses and shrubs. Horned larks are the earliest of the 3 to nest, beginning about the 3rd week in April and peaking about the 1st week of May. Thick-billed longspurs are next, initiating nesting about the 1st of May and peaking in mid-May. Thus, when horned larks are feeding young, thick-billed longspurs are still incubating. Lark buntings are the last to commence nesting. They start about mid-May and peak around June 1st. The nesting period of chestnut-collared longspurs overlaps that of lark buntings, but chestnut-collared longspurs tend to specialize the foods they bring their young, feeding mostly small grasshoppers and beetles. Lark buntings feed their young a diverse selection of insects, but where their selection of species overlaps, those chestnut-collared larkspurs, lark buntings, chose larger food items, again minimizing competition. It's now been 11 days since the young chestnut-collared larkspur hatched. This is the day the young should fledge and leave the nest. Around noon, the young fledglings depart the nest, with the oldest departing first. This brood was lucky. Half or more of all the chestnut-collared nests attempted fail due to predation. The most common nest predators are skunks, foxes, weasels, ground squirrels, snakes, and birds of prey. But some nest predators are the ones you would not suspect. Recently, 24 recording videos placed at nest sites have revealed some very unusual predators of ground-nesting grassland birds. Cottontail rabbits, white-tailed deer, deer mice, and even domestic cows were caught on video capturing and consuming grassland bird nestlings. Considering the number and diversity of animals that prey on the nest of grassland birds, it's no wonder grassland birds are among the most rapidly declining avian species. Collectively, their populations have declined by more than 40% since 1966. According to the Audubon Society's 2019 North American Grasslands and Bird Report, chestnut-collared longspurs populations have plummeted nearly 85% since the mid-1960s. The major contributor to that decline is not predation, however. It is the combination of habitat loss and fragmentation. To reverse this trend, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, a nonprofit organization created by Congress in 1984 to restore wildland species and their habitats, has assembled the North Great Plains Program, tasked with the goal of maintaining or improving 1 million acres of interconnected native grasslands. To accomplish this goal, the foundation aims to 1. Permanently conserve a minimum of 100,000 acres of grasslands in critical areas, 2. Increase connectivity and core native grasslands by restoring at least 150,000 acres of degraded habitat adjacent to native grasslands, and 3. Improve management on 750,000 acres of working land through management agreements that offer incentives to landowners to conserve and improve native grasslands. Last July, the North American Grasslands Conservation Act was introduced into the Senate, with Colorado's Senator Michael Bennet co-signing the legislation. The bill would allocate $290 million to be used for incentives to private landowners to conserve and restore grasslands and shrublands. However, these and other grassland conservation projects signal a turnaround for the chestnut-collared longspur and other imperiled grassland birds. Bruce Gill retired from the Division of Wildlife in 2001 after working 35 years in its research section. As the mammals research leader, he studied deer, elk, mountain goat, bighorn sheep, pronghorn, bear, moose, lynx, swift fox, mountain lion, and other wildlife. This article is copyrighted by the author. The Long Journey. From South America to the grasslands of Colorado, Swainson's hawk take to the sky for their long migration. Article by Dan Walters. This hawk, named after William Swainson of England, has one of the longest migration routes of any North American raptor. Starting in Argentina, these late nesters usually arrive in Colorado to breed in April. A round trip of nearly 12,000 miles. Once they arrive in Colorado, they can be found perched on telephone poles and trees overlooking open areas. Nest building usually begins 2 weeks after they arrive. These bulky nests are situated in trees overlooking grasslands and are usually freshly built every year. Some nests, however, are reused, and they have been known to take advantage of abandoned magpie nests. A normal clutch is usually 1 or 2 eggs, rarely more. Incubation is around 35 days. Once hatched, that's when the real work begins. While both will bring food, the male does much of the hunting early on while the female stays at the nest. Prey includes rabbits, field mice, gophers, and other small animals. These hawks can also be seen running through the fields chasing grasshoppers and other insects, their main prey outside of the nesting season. Over the last couple years, I've spent a lot of time observing a mated pair. I noticed the male would catch larger prey such as a rabbit, land in a tree near the nest, and then call for the female. Moments later, the female would fly to the male and grab the rabbit. It's interesting to note the female would not return directly to the nest, but instead fly to another perch, feed a little bit, then give the rest of the rabbit to the ever-demanding chicks. The young hawks fledge about 40 days later. They can be seen flying away from the nest, but still in the same territory. They still rely on the adults for food and can be heard crying out to be fed. Beginning in late August, they can be seen in agricultural lands, fueling up on large numbers of grasshoppers before gathering in large flocks, circling high in the air as they begin their long migration south. Dan Walters is a Colorado-based wildlife photographer and writer. His work has been featured frequently in Colorado Outdoors. You can see more of his work at danwaltersphoto.com. Bear Aware. Grants help residents be bear aware, one home at a time. By Dan England. Julie Knudsen found herself encouraged as she walked around with a few homeowners in the rural Trinidad area where her Purgatory Watershed Partnership operates. The area has been called by Colorado Parks and Wildlife officers as the most bear-centric in the state, and, as a result, bears have harassed her rural neighbors for years. Harassment by bears is the only kind of harassment where you can say the victim likely deserves it. Careless campers, homeowners, residents who, say, leave out greasy grills, food for feral cats, or open trash cans will draw hungry bears to their property faster than you could say, picnic a basket. But as Knudsen spent some time walking with homeowners around their property, she was impressed. Quote, "It was amazing," Knudsen said, "how much good stuff the owners were doing," end quote. And yet, Knudsen said, with resignation in her voice, the bears keep coming. Bears are smart, and more importantly, they are hungry, even desperate for easy calories, as they fatten up for winter. This is why she's applied for the Human Bear Conflict Resolution Community Grant. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Program is in its second year and has distributed 2 rounds of grants. The idea is to offer a little money to pay for ideas on how to control bears without hurting them. CPW started the program as a proactive way to prevent bears from being a problem. Despite the time CPW invests in education and spending thousands in state parks on special trash bins, problem bears, not proactive solutions, still take up most of the time, said Travis Long, grant manager for CPW. Quote, "A lot of times we're having to deal with what comes after the bear is a problem," end quote, Long said. The grant program was worth a try, and so far the outcomes are encouraging. Long said, because the bear problem may only be solved one property at a time, having community members help each other is a much better way to ensure the work is getting done. Quote, "The root of a lot of our bear issues is human behavior," Long said. "We can give out trash cans that will lock, but if residents don't use them, we don't have a lot of success with it. It's easier for community members to convince them to do it instead of us," end quote. Small mistakes matter. The hard part, Knudsen said, is even the good property owners would make mistakes, and small mistakes matter. Once a bear finds food on a property, or anything that smells like it, it will keep coming back. Humans, of course, are the same way, which explains why In-N-Out has such long lines. But in the bear's case, this is when the sad stuff happens. Officers can try to haze the bears away by shooting beanbags, using trained dogs, and blaring loud noises, but that doesn't always work, and if it doesn't, a bear will be deemed a nuisance. Eventually, the bear may have to be killed. There's a popular saying for it, a fed bear is a dead bear. So Knudsen said her agency used its grant to help property owners tighten up those holes. The nonprofit's mission is to protect, restore, and enhance the watershed through education and collaboration, among other efforts, and helping residents with bears was a clear part of the mission. Sometimes that meant working with other organizations, but many times it did indeed mean working with individual property owners. Sometimes the mistakes were so subtle, Knudsen found herself chuckling at the ways bears would find their way onto properties. Owners, for instance, would shower with their window open, and bears would become attracted to the sweet smell of shampoo. Or owners would forget to harvest fruit from their trees, and the bears would come to eat the fallen fruit. Quote, We are even encouraging them to maybe get rid of the trees, Knutson said. One owner wasn't harvesting the fruit, so she just cut it down and the problem was solved, end quote. For those who want to keep their trees, Knutson helped pay for electric fencing around them. She would do the same for those with beehives and chickens. They also handed out a lot of bear straps for garbage cans. They even solved a problem by literally getting creative. Homeowners didn't want bars in their windows, understandably not wanting to send the message that their home was a small Alcatraz, so they had local artists custom design bars in the shape of flowers. Quote, they were stylish, Knutson said, so they could keep the bears out but look cool, end quote. Vigilance works well. There's really only one rule for residents, organizations, or businesses applying for the grant. You can't kill the bear. You aren't really supposed to hurt it either, although tools such as electric mats are okay to a point. But CPW doesn't want to tell people what solutions they should prescribe. It's possible that someone could come up with a great idea. Quote, we're not being too specific, Long said, so we're encouraging innovations and solutions, end quote. So far, that's not happening, Long said. Quote, to be frank, I'm not seeing innovations coming in, Long said. They tend to gravitate toward proven things, end quote. That's okay, though, because being bear aware does take vigilance, and residents tend to keep after programs that they've proposed. Quote, we're not just going in there and telling them what to do, Long said. We want them to have ownership of the program they propose, end quote. Grant applications and therefore the solutions they propose are reviewed by CPW staff, both to protect the bears and to judge whether they have a chance to work, Long said. There are other ways CPW is trying to address the issue, including a working group of Colorado State University researchers, nonprofits, and businesses, such as trash haulers, that start meeting this summer. It's the first time CPW has had a group like this one to deal with bear issues. CPW doesn't know yet how it will measure the success of the program, other than ongoing monitoring to measure whether bear incidents are going down where grants were distributed. But perhaps it's enough that agencies such as Beulah Fire Protection and Ambulance District aren't making quite as many service calls. The district serves nearly 650 people and has a couple of full-time employees, though it will add 2 more this summer and 25 volunteers. Why does this matter when it comes to bears? Quote, it's sort of in the job description that when you serve a tiny town like this, you call the fire department for anything, end quote, says Brian Ware, the district chief. That means when a bear tries to break into a resident's home, they will likely get the call, Ware said. Ware once had to shoot beanbag rounds at a bear to rescue a woman from her mobile home. In the bad years, when bears have had a harder time finding food, such as drought or wildfires, those calls can pile up. This is why Ware was thankful for the CPW grant. The department has dispersed bear-resistant trash cans and unwelcome mats and established a loan program for electric fences for hobbyists who like to keep bees or grow fruit trees. They can keep the fence for a year, and if they like the results, they can purchase it from the department at a reduced rate. Quote, the big thing for us is trying to push bears back into their natural habitat, Ware said, but with that comes a lot of human education, end quote. Sometimes, simple measures such as locking car doors can solve more than you might think, Ware said. Bears can, and sometimes will, rip door handles off, but usually making it just difficult enough will deter them. Quote, they're just looking for easy food, Ware said, and will move on, end quote. Some of the education can mean compromises, such as mobile home owners who leave their windows open because it's hot and they can't afford air conditioning, Ware said. Unwelcome mats have helped in those cases, but some residents have pushed back on the initiatives because they've always done it one way and they don't want to change, Ware said. Some focused enforcement and threats of citation without handing any out helped encourage residents to clean up their properties. Ware said his district may present some innovative ideas, such as developing a few natural habitat locations with fruit trees and shrubs, although he's wrestling with the problem of how to protect those plants from deer while offering it to the bears. So for now, he's content to continue with proven methods that do seem to be working, at least for now. Quote, "It's not like we came up with something no one's ever done before," Ware said, "but so far we are definitely seeing improvement." End quote. Dan England is a freelance author and editor and a frequent contributor to Colorado Outdoors. This article is copyrighted by the author. Call for entries. Eligibility requirements and deadlines for Colorado Outdoors Magazine's annual photography issue. Since 2007, we at Colorado Outdoors Magazine have dedicated our November-December issue to photography. It has been a way to showcase the beautiful, dramatic, and inspiring images that come our way from both professional photographers and hobbyists that we would not normally have a place to include in our pages. For all these years, the submission process had been extremely casual, but with the growing interest in wildlife photography and the accompanying concerns of ethical photographic practices, we have firmed up our submission guidelines. Unlike some other magazines, this is not a contest. A panel is not involved to judge and award first place and prizes, etc. Our magazine staff selects all the images. Since this is not a contest, Colorado Parks and Wildlife employees are allowed to submit and share images that readers might not otherwise get a chance to see. Eligibility. At Colorado Outdoors, we encourage everyone to practice ethical photography. This means keeping your distance, respecting animals and the law. No trespassing and no stopping in areas where it is unsafe or illegal to do so. Learn and follow the laws and regulations of local, state, and national parks. Do not submit photographs of captive animals, zoos, game farms, rescues, etc. Do not destroy habitat to get a better photographic angle. Do not use drones for wildlife images. Animals need to be Colorado natives in Colorado locations, with a few exceptions. Landscape photographs can be taken anywhere it is legal to do so, but preference will be given to images taken in state parks, state trust lands, and state wildlife areas managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Photographs of people participating in activities overseen by CPW will also be considered. Photographs may not have been previously submitted or taken on assignment for Colorado Outdoors. Photos must have been taken by the person submitting the entries and may not infringe on the copyright of others. From this point forward, if it is discovered entrants have not followed the above rules in the images they submit, they will be disqualified. Submitting photos. Submissions will be accepted September 15th through October 15th, 2024. Contributors can send their files via digital transfer to this email: coloutdoors.submission@state.co.us. They can also be sent via Dropbox or by online large file transfer services like WeTransfer, Hightail, or FileSender. Make sure the file folder sharing is available through November. Images can also be sent via mail on CD, DVD, or flash drives. They will not be returned. Send to Colorado Outdoors Photography Issue Submissions, care of Wayne D. Lewis, 6060 Broadway, Denver, Colorado, 80216. Label each file with how you want your credit to appear and the species. For example, a mule deer photo taken by John J. Smith would be labeled as John J. Smith Mule Deer.tiff. Digital image should be submitted as uncompressed 8-bit TIFF files or high-resolution JPEGs with a minimum resolution of 2,400 by 3,600 pixels. Please do not upsize. We prefer digital files that have only little or no correction or sharpening. We may ask to see the raw file before publishing. Some of this work may be performed on our end in order to optimize photos correctly for process color magazine printing. Corner store, Colorado style. Sometimes you don't know what you need until you get there. With your mobile device, you can shop whenever and wherever you like, whether you're looking for books, hats, DVDs, and more, or need to purchase your yearly hunting and fishing licenses, a state parks pass, or a subscription to Colorado Outdoors Magazine. Colorado Parks and Wildlife makes it easy for you. You'll find everything you need at cpwshop.com. Give the gift of Colorado Outdoors Magazine. Colorado's premier conservation magazine is printed 6 times per year and is packed with Colorado hunting and fishing information and wildlife viewing opportunities. Plus, you get your choice of a free 40-page full-color hunting guide or fishing guide with your subscription. To order, call 1-800-417-8986 or go to cpwshop.com. Thank you for joining us for the July-August issue of Colorado Outdoors Magazine. Read by John Arnold.